In a video recently, we talked about the bad pedestrian experience in Miami, from waiting 4 minutes for a pedestrian light to the abundance of large SUVs to the lack of crosswalks and general disregard that drivers had for pedestrians, including drivers so intent on illegally passing a stopped school bus that the bus had to physically turn and diagonally block the road to allow children to exit and cross safely. It was a genuine surprise that put a damper on an otherwise great trip to an iconic city. And that was in the most pedestrian-heavy areas. It's hard to imagine what it would have been like in the suburbs. In response to this video, we got some comments telling us, basically, to stop complaining and stop comparing other places to our home country of Canada. We actually understand this instinctive and emotional reaction people have against strangers coming to their city and criticizing it. But whether or not we should stop complaining, what do the numbers actually say about danger on Miami's streets?
Last year, Miami-Dade County saw 358 traffic fatalities. That's across drivers, pedestrians, cyclists, and motorcyclists. For comparison, the city of Toronto saw just 45. You heard that right, 358 versus 45. Miami-Dade actually has a bit smaller of a population, but saw 8 times more traffic deaths. That's about 300 people dying on Miami's roads last year, who wouldn't be dead if Miami had even the traffic fatality rate of Toronto, hardly known as a European urbanist paradise. Miami-Dade also reported 30,000 people injured last year. That's more than 1% of the county's population being injured in a traffic crash in 1 year.
That's astonishing. A completely unacceptable level of risk to expose yourself to when leaving your home every day. That's a failure of multiple levels of government to provide basic safety and well-being to residents of the city, not just pedestrians and cyclists either. Miami-Dade saw 16 times more drivers killed last year than Toronto. You hear a lot of talk in the US about cities and crime, and basically every search result for "Is Miami safe?" talks about crime. But Miami has significantly more traffic injuries than violent crimes, and significantly more traffic deaths than homicides. If we can hold politicians and governments responsible for keeping us safe from crime, can't we hold them responsible for the carnage on the roads that they design and build?
We're focusing on Miami because we visited recently, but it's not unique. Lots of cities in the US have shockingly bad traffic safety records. In 2019, the safest American cities with a population over 500,000 were New York, Boston, DC, Seattle, and San Francisco. The most dangerous were Memphis, Albuquerque, Detroit, Jacksonville, and Tucson. You can probably see the pattern. More car-centric cities are deadlier, much deadlier. If we take all US cities with a population over 500,000, there's a really clear correlation between rates of driving and the city's overall rate of traffic fatalities. New York City has the lowest rate of car commuting and also the lowest traffic fatality rate. We can also look at the average car speed during rush hour from the TomTom Traffic Index, based on GPS data. Cities with faster traffic, like Detroit and Oklahoma City, have the most traffic deaths. How many people drive to work and how fast people drive are just two things that are easy to measure. But there are dozens of different factors behind these extreme differences, from road design to enforcement and the basic layout of communities.
Here's something that might be surprising. Canadian cities don't come close to the road danger you get in the more car-centric US cities. Let's go back to 2019 to match the year of the US database we're using, right before COVID. Our American benchmarks will be New York, Chicago, Houston, and Memphis, covering the full spectrum. Montreal comes in at 1.7 deaths per 100,000 people. Edmonton and Ottawa are in the same ballpark too, despite being fairly car-centric cities. Not as car-centric as Memphis or Jacksonville, but you wouldn't expect them to come in this close to New York either. We don't have a national database to look at every city in Canada like we had in the US, but the most dangerous we've been able to find is Surrey, BC, a suburb of Vancouver, which had 3.7 deaths per 100,000.
We do have complete data on states and provinces though, and Canadian provinces tend to do pretty well in comparison, but really it's still startling how much variation there is across the US. Many states are roughly on par with Canada or not that much worse, like Massachusetts, New Jersey, even Minnesota. But then the death numbers just keep increasing through places like Michigan, Texas, Arizona, Florida, Oklahoma, and Mississippi, reaching death rates that are wild outliers within the developed world. Part of this is that more rural states and provinces do worse, but we already saw earlier that there are big differences in cities. Compare Detroit to its Canadian counterpart across the river, Windsor, Ontario, whose roads are 1/7 as deadly. That's not to say it's entirely about road and city design, though. MIT researcher David Zipper has a few other explanations for some of these surprising differences between the US and Canada. While both countries are buying more SUVs, Americans are more likely to opt into the more dangerous full-size SUVs, like we noticed in Miami. Canadians also drive less and take transit more due to higher gas taxes. Canada has lower speed limits and more automated traffic enforcement. Canada apparently has penalties for drunk driving that are stricter and more consistently applied. We're not sure quite how much these factors explain. At least in places in Canada we've lived, speed cameras haven't seemed that common, and speeding is still very much the norm. But they do probably help explain some of these disparities. We can also speculate about other things like some cities having more of an aggressive driving culture, but honestly that's hard to quantify. Nearly everyone will tell you that their city has just the worst drivers.
Urbanist critiques often revolve around car dependency and the idea that it's bad to design cities that effectively require a car for basic tasks, like getting groceries or going to work. Skeptics often respond with something like, "What do you mean? Driving is freedom and convenience." And we have to point out that this denies freedom to people who can't or don't want to drive. Anyone under 16, many old people, lots of medical conditions, people who can't afford a car, and maybe people who've had bad traffic accidents in the past. But at its extreme, a car-centric city isn't just a place that makes it inconvenient to move around without a car. It's a place that makes it dangerous to get around even in a car. Under Vision Zero, people focus on pedestrian and cyclist deaths. But remember that Miami-Dade also saw 16 times more drivers killed last year than Toronto. Imagine if you went to a city and found out that they had 10 to 20 times more fire deaths per capita than other cities. We hope that in making these comparisons, we can show how extreme these death tolls are, and that it doesn't have to be that way. Better road design, more transit, more concern for pedestrians and cyclists, better road layouts and new developments, and ideally better regulation of dangerous vehicles at the federal level can all move the needle. If you don't want to look to Canadian cities or New York City, Seattle and Minneapolis are more typical US cities, with better safety records than average, although Minneapolis didn't show up on our analysis before because it didn't quite reach our 500,000 population cutoff.
For an international perspective, Sweden and Norway are pretty much the gold standard for traffic safety, based on OECD data. The UK, Japan, and Ireland do pretty well too. Canada is a bit behind, on par with France and Italy. New Zealand actually does worse, while the US is the big outlier in the developed world, falling between Georgia, that's the country, not the state, and Armenia. But like we tried to emphasize in the video, the US is an especially big country with a lot of variation.
Thanks for watching through to the end of the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and a special thanks to our supporters on Patreon.